Let's start this morning with this. Trans women should use toilets according to their biological sex. That is according to the Equalities Minister, Bridget Phillipson. This is in response, of course, to the UK Supreme Court's ruling a week ago on the legal definition of a woman. The Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, has welcomed the decision, saying it provides much needed clarity, and his office has confirmed that the Prime Minister no longer believes trans women are women. There have been protests against the decision, with critics saying it is incredibly worrying for the trans community. The ruling followed a long-running legal battle between the Scottish Government and the campaign group For Women Scotland. Earlier, I spoke to one of the directors of For Women Scotland, Susan Smith, and I asked her reflection on the outcome a week on.
It was a huge relief at the time. It was a really long road to get to the Supreme Court, and obviously we'd lost twice in Scotland. We didn't know what the result would be going in. Usually the Supreme Court gives you a little bit of notice. So the emotion last Wednesday was really quite intense, both in the Rema and back in Edinburgh, where they were allowed to make a noise and clap and cheer and cry, and we had to sit on our hands and hold our breath until the judge had finished speaking. Looking back, I mean, what we've said is we always believed that was the law. So in a way, nothing has changed, but in another sense, everything has changed because policy and guidance had run ahead of the law to such a degree that women's spaces were not being protected in practice.
You were in the Scottish Parliament yesterday to hear the Scottish Government's response to the ruling, and you have been calling on them to apologise to women. So what response have you had?
Nothing so far, and it's disappointing because this was a result of a campaign fought by ordinary women with no real financial backup and with no experience in law or politics. We managed to build a movement, and along the way we were subject to the most horrible abuse, some of it from politicians. And what we saw in recent days is that that has continued, and there have been some really quite extreme comments from members of the Scottish Parliament. And there has been no acknowledgement on the part of the Scottish Government that they were a part of creating that febrile environment where women were being attacked simply for expressing their opinions.
I want to get on to how the personal impact it's had on all of you and your backstory as well, how you came to form this group. But if you're a trans woman listening to this, do you have empathy for trans women who would argue that a week ago they had stronger rights than they do today?
Well, I think the sad thing is they didn't have the rights, in inverted commas, that they were told they had. And that is the responsibility of the organisations who misled everybody on the law. And they set out to do it very deliberately. And I think they use some of these people as pawns. And I think that we always said this was a separate protected characteristic. We were fully in favour of working out how people could be accommodated, but we needed clarity on when facilities were just for women. And that was our starting point. And I think the problem is, as somebody who is trans once said, that they could see in the future that there would have to be an absolute line drawn on biology, because that is the only way you can really do it in law. Everything else was a little bit of a civic contract. You know, I think people were accommodating of people, especially those they thought passed, because women are conditioned to be nice, and we are and have been very aware when people are vulnerable, and thought that we would give them a little bit of space and protection. The problem is that certain organisations really overstepped and really pushed this to the extent that we were being told that fully intact men with beards, or people like, I suppose, we all saw the pictures of the double rapist Isla Bryson, and there were some people who were absolutely standing up and saying that that was a woman. And I think when you got to that point, we had to pull it back, and the only way we could pull it back was to biology. And I would say that there were a lot of women who suffered an awful lot during that period. There were an awful lot of women in prisons, in hospitals, in domestic abuse shelters, in rape crisis shelters who were branded bigots for wanting to be safe. And I didn't see much empathy extended to them. So I think women are always expected to show empathy, but people are often less ready to show empathy to the most vulnerable women.
Where does that accommodation, you mentioned the word accommodation, women having to be the accommodating ones. Have you thought on where that accommodation now lies for trans women in this situation?
I think that has to be men. And I think we have to have conversations about how men can make sure that other men are safe. And, I remember during the time when a lot of gay men were attacked and abused for their sexuality. And there was never any suggestion that they should then be accepted into female spaces and we should protect them. Because women aren't human shields. And male violence is a problem, whether that's male on male violence or male on female violence. And so I think it behoves us all to think very carefully about how we can tackle some of these issues. But I would also say that I think there's room in certain organisations for third spaces, and that won't just be for trans individuals. There are a lot of people who could benefit from having third spaces. If you have a carer who is of the opposite sex, for example, of somebody, they might appreciate being able to go into a space with that person. So there is an argument about how we broaden society and broaden the spaces and services we provide while not penalising or taking away from the services that are specific to women.
Let's talk about your organisation, because we've heard the title For Women Scotland quite a few times, but people don't necessarily know the women behind the story that everybody is talking about now. What brought you together and who are you all?
So the three directors and myself, I was a former fund manager in New York and the City of London, and I had stopped work to look after my three children. I'd done bits since then, but nothing particularly permanent. Marion Calder, who's with the NHS, and Trina Budge, who's a farmer up in the far north of Scotland. And I largely came across them online on Mumsnet, which is sneered at a lot by people who don't value mothers or who think that mothers all lose their brains when they give birth. That was how we started. We were tiny. I mean, the For Women name was actually a play because the original people in Marion's Room, when they founded it, there was Marion, Trina, Magdalene, and her girlfriend Nicole. And they said at that point they didn't know if it had ever be any more than four of them.
So it was literally four women. That's an interesting detail. I mean, just to put the listeners into the picture, I mean, it was back in 2018, wasn't it, when the Scottish Parliament passed a bill designed to ensure gender balance on public boards. This is what you were unhappy about. Why?
Yes, so it was quite a little remarked bill, but Trina, who is absolutely forensic, and she goes through everything, and she finds the devil in all the detail. And one of the things that she was very unhappy about was that the description of a woman in that bill, the definition of a woman in that bill, it said it was anybody who identified as a woman. And it then expanded that to say that could mean they used female pronouns or they had a female name on their electricity bill. And then it's further said, but then you don't need to provide any evidence of this. So essentially, we thought, well, it renders the whole thing meaningless because anybody can claim to be a woman under this. It doesn't matter if you only decided to identify as a woman 5 minutes before walking into the interview. So we couldn't do anything about it in 2018. We, as I say, were tiny and ineffective, and we had hardly anybody was listening to us. But by 2020, we'd got enough head of steam. There was another consultation on it. And so we thought we'd challenge the government. We took them to judicial review and we won. And then they went back and amended that to say that it was biological women and anybody with a GRC, a gender recognition certificate, that said they were a woman. And that is the part that we've been challenging now for the last 2 years.
There have been, as you say, there's been a series of legal challenges through crowdfunding, donations, because this doesn't come cheap. A reported £70,000 donation from J.K. Rowling that you were able to fund the latest legal challenge through the Supreme Court. What do you say to people that say you have been bankrolled by high-profile people like her and that you are, in essence, an anti-trans lobby group?
Well, it's nonsense, really, because we're very grateful to J.K. Rowling for that donation, but the entire cost of this particular judicial review was over £400,000, and most of that came through in small individual donations. I worked out that for our first judicial review, the donations averaged about £37. So it was literally thousands of women giving us small amounts. And I think it's quite insulting to them when people think or pretend to think that this is some movement that's funded by high rollers, because it really isn't. As far as, the accusations that we're anti-trans, I would say that only works if you think that people who believe women have the right to privacy, dignity, and safety, if you think that being pro-women is in itself inherently anti-trans. It's saying that women are not allowed to have their own political or social movement without hurting other people. And I don't think that's fair or correct.
You've made yourself very visible, and none of you, thanks for outlining that, have any kind of background in this kind of campaigning. And I know you've carried on doing your normal jobs alongside all of this. What kind of personal toll has it taken? Because the arguments have got very heightened over the years, haven't they?
Yes, they have. And I was really scared initially about becoming visible, because I'd always regarded myself as one of those people who's very middle of the road, probably slightly lefty liberal. And I hadn't been getting the sort of information. It was a shock to me when I started looking at what had been happening in law and society, because I really hadn't understood the full impact of it. And I think a lot of women were in that position. And it was very difficult when I first went to the committee on the census in 2018. I was really scared that how I would be perceived. And I think some of the demonization is very upsetting. For me, the worst thing is not particularly the abuse and the threats, which are disgusting and sometimes graphic, but they come from a certain sector of people who probably would like to send the sorts of threats to women anyway. I think the things that most upset me are when people think you genuinely want to hurt them and that you're genuinely out to destroy their lives. We're not. I'm certainly not. I certainly don't hate anybody. And the idea that we are wanting people to kill themselves or be miserable is very far from the truth.
We are starting to see the implications borne out, conversations around how does this apply then to health, education, business. Are you happy with what you've heard a week on? Are you happy with the direction of travel on that?
Yes, I think there's a lot of the commentary coming from lawyers has been great. Aqua Reindorf wrote a piece in the Times the other day that's very clear, sets things out very well. And of course, she is part of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, and they'll be following it up. And there's been lots of good commentary I've seen from lawyers online.
What's next for you? Is it over as far as you're concerned?
No, we will keep on going, because we do need to make sure all this guidance is sorted. We do need to make sure that it carries through into practice. We know there will be pushback, and so we're going to have to deal with that and meet that.
That's Susan Smith, one of the founding members of the campaign group for Women Scotland.